Hello. Thank you for coming. Thank you also to the team at Seoul Museum of Art. Thank you for your endurance. Every so often, in the northernmost reaches of human inhabitants on our globe, a lone seal hunter, most likely a Greenlandic Inuit, ventures into a calm body of water, a sea or a lake, with the sun shining overhead, or perhaps piercing directly into the eyes of the seal hunter. The air might be diffuse with clouds, just overcast enough for the sky to reflect completely an exact one-to-one replica on the glassy mirror of the water's surface. In these moments, when land becomes sky and sky becomes land, the faithful tether of the horizon dissipates. Confused by the simulation of floating in an eternal sky, the seal hunter is cast out with no direction, floundering in an impossibly pristine landscape, a too perfect rendering of his surroundings. Anxiety, panic, wild hallucinations set in. The seal hunter mistakes a psychosomatic feeling of cold swelling inside him for water seeping through the base of the kayak, a taunt of assured frostbite, hypothermia, drowning. He sees strange visions of mythic creatures, part human, part sea animal, benevolent goddesses or monsters of the deep. Only by paddling vigorously, desperate to survive, can he break the spell of such intense isotropism. Mountaineers also, when they reach high altitudes, report experiencing a sort of psychosis. With the air too thin and the brilliance of the white snow too overwhelming, they start to hear voices, to witness birds with giant wings alighting on icy crags, to make out folkloric humanoid creatures bounding through blizzards. And so too do those on long treks through dense tracts of forest make note of lucid visions, sensations of beasts trailing them, or spirit realms flittering into existence within the periphery of their vision. These conditions are emblematic of a sort of psychosis that accompanies a loss of orientation. On the open ocean, in the boundless desert, snaking through icy tundras, trekking through endless wilderness, these landscapes all engender a complete disorientation, as the qualities of these regions annihilate any means of accessing reference points that indicate direction or distance. With a loss of global positionality, one is liable to lose entirely a conception of the self. Into this void of consciousness crawl hallucinations, mirages, beasts of the imagination. When the panic of disorientation sets in, monsters come out to play. It is no surprise that worldwide our mythologies are peppered with beasts who live in these sorts of locales. When the visual assurances of geography that we take for granted are thrown out the window, suddenly our world becomes inhabited by Bigfoots, Yetis, or sea serpents. In collective consciousness, a sudden lack of societal orientation has a similar capacity to produce its own monsters. As the Western age of enlightenment crested into the age of industrialization, for example, the rapid transformation of civil society produced by this new technical epoch harbingered a period of extreme anxiety. In this space of stress and alienation, we encounter a new breed of monster, literary monsters that are galvanized in the physical space of industry, the factory, the laboratory, the doctor's office, as living testament to the hyperbolic horrors of medical or technological advancement gone awry. So the canonical monster from Mary Shelley's 1816 novel Frankenstein is begotten by a mad scientist who infuses an assemblage of parts from corpses with a surge of electricity, thus generating life. The monster exists as a metaphor for the worker disfigured by the technological rampage of industrial capitalism. Literary theorist Franco Moretti contrasts Frankenstein's monster with another monster, born of the pages of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula. Moretti writes, Frankenstein's monster and Dracula lead parallel lives. They are two indivisible because complementary figures, the two horrible faces of a single society, its extremes, the disfigured wretch and the ruthless proprietor, the worker and the capital. Moretti has identified Dracula in contrast to Frankenstein's monster. Thus, the paradigmatic division of society along mechanistic lines extends into the meaning-making we associate with the deep recesses of our imagination. In this modernist mythologizing, the Fordist worker is the wretched amalgam of used body parts, while the property owner becomes the life-sucking leech who continuously amasses his fortune. In the contestation of art historian Linda Nochlin, dismembered body parts are apt emblems of this period of rapid industrialization in the West. In a 1994 book titled The Body in Pieces, The Fragment as a Metaphor of Modernity, Nochlin's opening conversation hinges on a drawing from between 1778 to 1780 by the Swiss painter Henry Fuseli. The work is entitled The Artist's Despair Before the Grandeur of Ancient Ruins, and depicts an artist in a fit of melancholy, seated in solitary despair and dwarfed by fragments of the Colossus of Constantine at the Capitoline Museums in Rome. The artist's experience of modernity contrasts with the near-divine glory of antiquity, symbolically represented by two imposing simulacra of power, the strapping foot and the hand with index finger outstretched as if issuing a decree. These detached body parts set the stage for Nochlin's discussion of the use of fragmentation, partial images, and mutilation to express grief in a period of uprooted social order and nostalgia for previous epochs characterized by a social continuity for which we can now only yearn. A metaphysical fragmentation, Nochlin writes, seems to mark modern experience, a loss of wholeness, a shattering of connection, a destruction or disintegration of permanent value that is so universally felt in the 19th century as to be often identified with modernity itself. Another work of Fuseli's can be invoked here to gesture towards a means of recourse taken by artists to combat this corporeal atomization. This is perhaps Fuseli's most famous work, his 1781 painting, The Nightmare. The work depicts a woman in the throes of a deep sleep. On top of her and at the foot of her divan are manifestations of her nightmare, a predatory incubus and a ghastly horse's head. It's important to note that Fuseli renders the woman on her back, which is a position that at the time was thought to encourage nightmares. Fuseli himself experienced waking dreams, or hyper-realistic visions that occur in the state of mind between waking and sleeping, when one's tether to consciousness and rationality is waning. Dwelling in this zone of unreality, allowing the unsettling elements of nightmares to overtake one's mental state, Fuseli seems to suggest, serves as a potential foil to the industrialized horrors of modern life. And actually, Freud, because he's been invoked earlier today, Freud had a print of this painting in his office right next to the Rembrandt painting, The Anatomy Lesson. Art practices of the early modern period became an outlet for investigation into the effect of this industrialization on the human form, from fragmented monsters to despairing artists dwelling in the realms of the unconscious. These examples preempt the desire for a way out of mechanized society. Other aspects of visual culture were likewise marked by a decisive blurring of the boundaries between the living and the more than human, whether monster, spirit, the unconscious, or the dead. Biotechnical experiments, aided by the newfound ability to harness electricity, sparked aspirations of immortality. New chemical techniques for the preservation and embalming of corpses, coupled with the rise of post-mortem photography, brought the dead and living into a profoundly close physical space, what scholar John Troyer has deemed an embalmed vision. With eyes clouded by this embalmed vision, the modern corpse becomes atemporal, No longer subject to the biology of decomposition, the post-mortem subject is even deemed worthy of public display through funerary ritual or photographic image. Indeed, with the advent of each new form of technology, we careen closer toward closing our symbolic chasm between the living and the dead, the human and the non-human. In the words of Paul Virilio, when you invent the ship, you also invent the shipwreck. When you invent the plane, you also invent the plane crash. And when you invent electricity, you invent electrocution. Every technology carries its own negativity, which is invented at the same time as technical progress. So our contemporary conception of the triangulation between the monstrous, death, and spiritualism has been shaped by a cultural imagination struggling to make sense of the advent of industrial technology with the capacity to cause catastrophe on a scale previously unknown, but also with the capacity to record the aftermath of these catastrophes in forms of image making that can be mechanically reproduced and disseminated. Whereas the European Age of Enlightenment may have been characterized by the human aspiration to investigate, taxonomize, and rationalize our natural world, attempts to divulge the mysteries of environmental phenomena, the resulting industrial revolution sought to exert control over this newly commodifiable nature. Now we're again facing an onslaught of technological innovation. With artificial intelligence, machine learning, and algorithmically mediated data, whether factual or not, serving as the means through which we perceive reality. An impulse arises among artistic communities in both of these eras, the desire to somehow heal the world through a sustained and rigorous engagement with a form of spiritualism or shamanism that prioritizes making contact with the deceased and mystically achieving a sort of inner alchemy that fulfills an incarnation of body and soul. While artists like Fuseli may have gazed longingly at Western antiquity for a way out of the modernist quagmire, contemporary artists across the globe have embraced non-Western and indigenous traditions that have always relied more heavily on a way of seeing that is not dependent on Enlightenment era dichotomies for a metaphysical tether beyond what is presented tangibly or rationally by our contemporary technological apparatuses. Through an embrace of the inherent slipperiness of categories, current shamanistic practice exists along lines that Donna Haraway, for example, outlined in her 1985 Cyborg Manifesto, when she contended that the boundaries between entities on which modernism had been founded were no longer convincing. So she identified these partitions along three vectors: between human and animal, between organism and machine, and between the physical and the non-physical. Bruno Latour also corroborates Haraway's notion in his book, We Have Never Been Modern, which was first published in 1995. Latour contests that the separation of nature and culture, which is what modernity hinges on, is untenable, given the failure of most contemporary aspects of life to fit cleanly into one of these capturing categories. Part of the interweaving of these flawed categories entails a simultaneous embrace of technology and spirituality. Epitomized by the concept of embalmed vision, spirituality often finds itself craving a sort of scientific foundation. Along these lines, and at a moment when again we find ourselves at a loss for orientation among these rapid changes, techno-shamanism has become a popular means of this reconciliation. The figure of the shaman has been invoked by many artists, such as Joseph Beuys or Nam June Paik. Beuys viewed shamanism as a technology in and of itself, one he adopted after a self-mythologized plane crash in Crimea during World War II, wherein he was saved by Tatars who treated his wounds with animal fat and wrapped him in felt. He transposed this fascination with indigenous healing practices onto a lifelong goal of healing the world's social ills through shamanistic ritual and folkloric belief. often adopting the role of the medicine man. In one of his most well-known works, I Like America and America Likes Me, from 1974, Boyce traveled by ambulance from John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City to the Rene Bloch Gallery without ever setting foot on American soil, and spent 3 days in the gallery with a wild coyote named Little John. With the coyote standing in as an apex symbolic animal in Native American cosmology, as well as a signifier of indigenous displacement and attempted extermination by white settlers, Boyce performed a series of actions. He read the day's Wall Street Journal, cloaked himself in a felt blanket, and puttered around, gesticulating at the coyote with a shepherd's staff in hand. Little John occasionally gnawed at Boyce's blanket or peed on the newspapers. By spending his time with an animal deemed to implicate an intrinsic way of being in America, Boyce proffered a ritualistic means of reconnection, intent to revive a primal harmony between humans, nature, and a shared land. Nam June Paik, as well, saw his experiments with early video and electronic arts as an attempt at providing shamanistic rituals toward global healing. From his first solo exhibition in Germany in 1963, he affixed the head of a bleeding bull at the gallery's entrance. The bull meant to signify a symbolic crossing between secular and divine realms, thus inaugurated a lifelong practice dedicated to a refusal of the notion that the human and spirit realms are necessarily discrete. This penchant toward an inherent unity of elements extended further toward the newness of mass media technology, which Paik insisted should syncretize with shamanistic ritual. In TV Garden, for example, a work from 1974 to 77, Paik filled a room with tropical plants set among 40 TV sets, each playing his video work Global Groove. This aesthetic conjunction challenges the artificiality of a contemporary technological regime and fuses it with a conception of immersive, bountiful, and sheltering landscape, where one is as liable to experience the transcendence of the numinous as to witness reality mediated by a liquid crystal screen. In techno-shamanism, science is not seen at odds with a spiritualist impulse. Rather, the advent of new technologies enables a deeper and farther-reaching capacity to achieve and maintain contact with realms beyond the human, an ethical standpoint that allows for a progressive movement toward emancipation. While mechanized societies inscribe on the bodies of their subjects a sort of atomized and automated corporeality, techno-shamanism provides a proposal for possible recourse by subverting the very technology that prolongs a type of Fordist regimentation, instead using this technology toward a technology of the spirit. It's important to underscore here that works within the techno-shamanist realm are not obscurantist or reactionary. They're not a rejection of science and technology in favor of alternative or conspiratorial meaning-making systems. Rather, they're a rejection of the sort of rationalist logic of industrial capitalism. They do not dismiss scientific inquiry out of hand so much as trouble the marriage of technology and anti-rationalism. Works from post-colonial contexts in particular frame indigenous and pre-colonialism ways of knowing in contrast to the imposed strident adherence to Enlightenment empiricism that is championed by Western systems of ordering society. While Western science, medicine, and governance focus on accumulating data, indigenous practices are more comfortable reveling in the promise of ritual and the mystery of what is occluded and cannot be accessed by human rationalism. As such, artists working within this framework propose notions of multiple worlds that exist among and alongside our own. In these formulations, the possibility of emancipation from dispossession, capitalism, systemic disadvantage may be accessed through spiritual ritual that taps into hidden realms beyond ontological reality. these types of spiritual ritual are distinct from a perversion of techno-mysticism as is practiced by many exploitative tech entrepreneurs within the United States Silicon Valley. In this context, spirituality and science are enjoined toward transhumanist goals that include cryogenic immortality for the ultra-wealthy and enhancement of the human form through an extractive use of technology. So in closing, I want to invoke two figures from the Korean context. You'll have to pardon my pronunciation, but these are the Taoist monks Kim Sai-sup and Jong Reon, who lived during the 1400s. Within the Joseon dynasty, their explorations into Buddhist and Taoist teachings proved slightly heretical within the context of a dynasty founded on Neo-Confucianism. But Taoism in this era seemed to hinge on a dedication to prolonging life, achieved through a sort of inner alchemy, as much as it did on spiritual freedom. So this practice of inner alchemy had two manifestations, Weidan and Neidan. Weidan, which was practiced by Jong Reong, focused on herbal medicine, chemistry, and scientific experimentation, while Kim Sai-sup leaned toward Neidan, which in contrast to Weidan prioritizes a fulfillment of present life through a body and spirit dualism. In Kim's telling, this maintenance of bodily vitality was to be achieved through the nurturing of one's own nature, dependent on a sort of disciplined labor practice. So, if progressive emancipation for our current era might rely on a sort of reification of previously segmented dichotomies as well as older ways of knowing, which can be accessed through communication with the dead, then perhaps the dual practices of inner alchemy can serve as a potential way forward. Contemporary art that is engaged with the crises and questions of our time favors a sort of techno-shamanism that brings the impulses of both Weidan, with its investigation into medicine and science, and Neidan, with its focus on monism, into conjunction. In the research that is forming the basis of our exhibition, the role of the shaman is not one that is tied to a particular geography or culture, but allows for a relativistic accessibility, intent on a re-animism of the world, or at least a cursory acknowledgement that the world itself has agency outside of the loss of autonomous human subjectivity as delineated by algorithms and big data behavioral models. Our exhibition hopes to mediate between these strains within modern and contemporary art while proposing a means of transdisciplinary and transcultural mediation between the known and the unknown, the seen and the seen, the explainable universe and its penchant for defying rationality.
긴 시간 동안 자리에 함께 해주신 분들께 감사드립니다. 바로 질의응답 시간을 이어가도록 하겠습니다. 네, 세 분의 발표와 여러 작품을 감상하면서 지난 미술사에서 정말 많은 예술가들이 새로운 상상의 어떤 공간으로서 영적이고 정신적인 영역들을 탐구해 왔다는 걸 재확인할 수 있었습니다. 여러분들께서 질문을 생각하신 동안 제가 먼저 하나 예술감독팀에게 질문을 던져보겠습니다. 이번 지금 준비하시는 서울 미디어시티 비엔날레는 서울이라는 지역을 배경으로 하고 있는데요. 제시하시는 주제가 서울의 지역성, 그러니까 동시대 서울과 어떻게 연결될 수 있을지 궁금합니다. 그리고 이 주제를 만들어 오시면서 특별히 한국의 전통이나 어떤 문화에 관심을 갖고 있는 부분이 있다면 답변 부탁드리겠습니다.
Thank you for the question. something I just thought of in response to your question is yesterday we were meeting with Jing Guan from the biennial office, and she showed us the catalog of the 2000 edition of Media City Biennial. And already in year 2000, the kind of thematic underpinning of the biennial was an attempt to use technology in an expanded form to mediate between the city and between artistic practice. And so I was quite inspired to see the catalog and to understand that this has been kind of an undercurrent of the entire Seoul Media City Biennial since its inception. And I think our kind of thematic framework is a means of prolonging that sort of mediation. We spoke a bit about Séance as a kind of mediating ritual or tool. And we hope to use this exhibition as an opportunity to engage with that technology as a form, a methodology. And then I think, I mean, this is all just based on very preliminary research. We just started the project. But in terms of the larger Korean context, something that's been really impactful to begin researching is the history of shamanism here. And something for me, I was realizing recently, kind of this difference between how spiritual practices have manifested in the West versus in non-Western contexts where they have existed for a lot longer or have been accepted for a lot longer. In kind of the Western context we discussed in our talks, these spiritual practices were always kind of sequestered to an artistic avant-garde and were a bit like an elephant in the room. They weren't so talked about publicly. Which is probably why in a lot of Western contexts, the idea of spirits can have a bit of a negative connotation. They're often entities that haunt or place curses, whereas in non-Western contexts, they're much more benevolent entities. So I just on a very preliminary basis, this kind of dialectic that appears between how something like this is perceived in both of these contexts has already been quite enlightening, and I think it's something that we'll continue to research and develop as the project develops. Okay.
네, 답변 감사합니다. 그럼 객석에서 질문 주실 분들 계실까요? 손 들어 주시기 바랍니다.
안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. 저는 윤종원이라고 하고요. 저는 그 마지막에 상영된 두 작품 중에서 앞에 상영했던 구보타 시게코의 작품에 대한 견해에 대해서 좀 구체적으로 여쭙고 싶은데요. 제가 이 작가에 대한 그 배경 지식이 없어서 오해를 하는 거일 수도 있겠지만, 제가 지금 작품을 봤을 때에 이 어떤 테크노 샤머니즘의 이 담론의 시각에서는 이런 푸티지들을 이렇게 활용하고 이것을 이제 이런 비디오 기술이나 이런 것들을 연결해서 확장하는 방식들이 매우 흥미로운데, 한편으로는 이 일본인 작가가 미국의 애리조나주에 가서 이 영상들을 담고 그리고 그것을 편집하는 방식 같은 것들이 이 서구의 식민주의 때 촬영한 이제 다른 그들이 제3세계라고 부르는 다른 세계에 가서 그것을 담아와서 그것을 나열하는 방식과 큰 틀에서는 그런 태도가 다르게 느껴지지 않은 부분이 있어서 뭔가 조금 계속 보면서 약간 마음이 한편으로는 그런 의심이 계속 드는 그런 부분이 있었거든요. 그래서 그런 부분에 대해서 어떤 견해를 가지고 계신지 궁금해서 여쭤보고 싶습니다.
Yeah, I can start. I can start. I mean, it's a great question, and thank you for posing it because it's also kind of there is like some obvious features in the film that on the one hand, actually, it does refer to the production year, which is 1970s. On the other hand, there is also we could complicate a little, maybe knowing Shigeko Kubota's, artistic biography. Your question, because yes, she is in the US and in Arizona, but there is like a history of her own way of making videos, which is diaristic, and this is just one of many examples. Some of you know of her video diaries films, and as in many of them at that time, probably not so self-reflectively, but she embarks this very straightforward, one could even say a bit naive approach towards the world as basically making her own diary, but at the same time she always positions also herself as a newcomer or a person who immigrated to the US, and that's what actually to some extent pushed her to make diary films, since, as you know, this is a genre when you are like talking about yourself, but when you would make your diaries, you also somehow try to figure out your identity and your own position in the world. She positioned herself as an artist, maybe not in exile, but not in her own place, not in her own country. And then, of course, I completely buy your argument, but one could see that she's also trying to find some kind of a connection to the Navajo people, not as an American, but as Shigeko Kubota. And definitely you could see it as a bit of maybe naive attempt from today's perspective specifically, but the way she kind of installs certain critique of, American lifestyle with like a water metaphor when she feels that, water is missing here and was somebody taking a car to get water. I mean, it's too obvious to explain, right? But one could see like some kind of empathy she, as Shigeko Kubota, has with Navajo people. So without saying that you're wrong, I also like propose this to see, like, especially given this time distance to the film, to see that side of her work. Yeah, but maybe that's the commentary I wanted to make. Maybe if you want to add something.
Yeah, I think there's also the moment in the film where she's told that her name means sister-in-law or brother-in-law in Navajo language, and it's not like a flattening of cultural relativism, but is a kind of argument that across planes.
네, 오늘 발표랑 비디오 프로그램 잘 봤습니다. 제 생각에는 아마도 그 상하이 비엔날레 때는 그 시네마가 굉장히 모든 것을 이제 관통하는 시노그래피적으로 관통하는 것이었으면, 여기서 아마 광영회라는, 그리고 이제 원형이라든가 소용돌이 형태로 이렇게 대변되는 이 형식이 뭔가 그 시노그래피적으로 구현되지 않을까 하는 기대감을 좀 갖게 되는 부분이 있었습니다. 그 마지막 여러 가지 힌트를 통해서도 그렇고요. 그래서 제가 이렇게 좀 그 느낀 이 점들이 좀 그 실제로 그 실현이 될 부분이 있는 것인지 좀 궁금하고 첫 번째 질문으로는 두 번째 질문으로는 그 특히 왜 한국에서 하는 비엔날레에서 특히 오컬트적이거나 이런 강령회 같은 것에 포커스를 특히 두게 되었는지 그 안톤의 프랙티스에서 굉장히 많은 것들이 이렇게 나올 수 있는 부분을 알고 있는데 그 특히나 조금 더 이렇게 신비주의와 오컬트적인 그 맥락이 이 서울 미디어시티 비엔날레에 더 이렇게 제한되게 됐는지 그 부분이 상당히 궁금합니다.
Well, I think, thank you very much for the question. As I mentioned before I started speaking, it's an idea that has been in my head for many years, for almost 30 years, that this is one topic that actually has not received a kind of a systematic exploration, that it's so strange because it had such an enormous impact on art. And as an artist myself and as a curator yourself, we all know how artistic practice is intertwined with spiritual practice. And yet, to me, it almost seems like the institution of art history, the institution of the arts on the level of museums and exhibitions are slightly embarrassed about it. Why? I don't know. I can speculate. Maybe art, for so many centuries, at least in Europe, was very much commissioned and sponsored by organized religion, mainly by Vatican and stuff like that. And for very many centuries, all artists did was basically illustrate, a religious text, the Bible. So when art kind of liberated itself from this topic and assumed the sovereignty to decide on its own subjects, it doesn't want to go back to it. That departure was so important, and so it was such a struggle to achieve that there is some kind of a reluctance to consider things within this framework. But nevertheless, I think it's really overdue for many, many, many reasons. But also, it's quite interesting to try to do it here in Korea because, Korea has one of the most diverse religious and spiritual contexts. Maybe it's quite unique in the world. There are more religions here, old religions, new religions, cults, various movements than in just about any country. South Korea is not a very large country, but the proliferation of different beliefs is simply astounding. So when we were discussing our proposal and what would be, it just seemed like if there is a place where these ideas could be explored in a sort of a very multifaceted way, in a very complex way, maybe this is the place, but
maybe just to add one thing, which I think could be obvious from our presentations, we also do not want to pose it as a only exhibition about the spirituality of some kind of expo of different spiritual practices or something like this. Almost opposite, we really, and what I try to make, and I think Hallie in her presentation specifically, we want to see it dialectically in connection to the technologization, and as well as in broader sense, Fordist and post-Fordist capitalism, and how spirituality is interrelated to that. And of course, then there is a even more challenging attempt to see it in the Western world and in other places. It's not like a homogeneous same interrelation, but given today's world, there are a lot of similar, global features of spirituality being connected to the technology, and technology being used in a certain economic and ideological system. So this is, I think, would hopefully make our exhibition also having another layer of critique, which we are looking for, and to end with that, there is a commonly agreed kind of technological shift. I would not say maybe paradigmatic, but getting closer to that. That's happening in the past 10 years. So these parallels we were drawing about late 19th century and today, we really believe that it's time to think about it. So yeah, maybe it's not direct answer, but since you said why you started to think about spirituality, I wanted to add that more layers to our idea about spirituality.
And to answer the first question about scenography, yes, in Shanghai, which is the show we worked on last year, 2 years ago, yeah, last year, we were using montage or kind of editing principles of cinema as the methodology to construct the scenography of that show. So similarly for this show, we're hoping to use the principles of Séance to devise a scenography that does feel like an embodied experience of an exhibition. This is our task for the coming months, so we're not yet sure how exactly it will happen, but that is the intent.
네, 앞쪽에.
잘 듣고 잘 봤습니다. 감사합니다. 저는 이 많은 작품들 중에서 오늘 저희들에게 보여주신 작품들을 선택하고 나열한 방식이 굉장히 궁금한데요. 그것이 어떤 것이 작동해서 이런 식으로 선택하시고 또 나열하셨는지 말씀해 주셨으면 좋겠고요. 그 중에 이제 제가 좀 흥미롭다고 느꼈던 게 예를 들어 여러 가지 이 작품들에서 여러 가지 접점들을 저는 좀 찾을 수 있었는데 그 중에 한 가지가 예를 들면은 길가메시 작품하고 그리고 마지막으로 본 변형의 마음의 장소 사유의 흐름이라는 그 작품에 보면 맨 앞부분에 신기하게도 요거트가 나와요. 여기선 액티비아로 나오지만 거기서는 장수를 주는 걸로 요거트가 나오는데 그런 것들을 이렇게 일부러 관계 relatedness를 주시고 그것을 선택하셔서 그렇게 나열하셨는지 얘가 그런데요. 다른 작품들 중에서도 이렇게 연결되는 부분들이 몇 가지 있었는데 그렇게 이 작품을 선택하고 나열하실 때 그런 것들을 염두하시고 의도적으로 하신 건지 궁금합니다.
Thank you so much. Yogurt is very funny. It was totally unintentional, yes. Yeah. Strange coincidence. But yes, there are quite a few overlaps and quite a few connections. I actually noticed it myself while watching, just like you. There was something with water as a kind of a metaphor that's used in many of the films we showed today. But, you know, there is a kind of a structure to it. Like, let's say the first three films have to do with death, because that's maybe my part of the presentation was largely maybe about the significance of death within this conversation about art, spirituality, and technology, and specifically speaking to the dead, or the dead speaking to us. And then maybe Lucas can speak about the selection of the films in his program.
I will maybe sound repetitive, but you know, to be very honest, I didn't want to find the films that completely illustrate, because I don't believe in kind of film's power to illustrate. But as I said in my presentation, I was thinking about the films that kind of could engage into a dialogue with our thoughts, and the dialogue is not necessarily that they support or, you know, just illustrate or say the same thing in cinematic way, but that they have something in common, and that it becomes a productive exercise that you just had, and we all had, thinking about these films, being in dialogue with the ideas, and to some extent, I think it could be even wrong if someone would think that like artworks in general could completely, illustrate the concepts. They just working towards the same goal, but with their own means. And since our ideas are also very initial ones, we started to work very recently on after we were selected on all this very intricate and multi-layer topic, and we have some time for research, which is amazing. So we're also at the same time seeing who are working within similar thematics, and to some extent this is an amazing workshop for us also, and maybe for all of us together here, to kind of see and notice those connections. Some of them are like very minor ones, like yogurt, but in the end I was also like, wow, because the idea is similar, and even the tone and humor, like there is something there, but also we can expand it, and it's not about yogurt, as we all know, it's about something else. So answering shortly, we thought, of course, about which films could be in dialogue with our ideas, and then we just let them talk, and that's what happened. We heard this dialogue, I guess.
I'll add just briefly the last film, the yogurt film. I think it was also important for us to have a work that spoke to this kind of contemporary techno-mysticism movement, and obviously she's poking fun at these kind of fads around spirituality or dieting or wiggles. So it was important to underscore that we're not so invested in this conception of techno-mysticism that is an attempt at kind of a transhumanism or like an anti-rationalist position. I think something that was apparent in Lucas's presentation was the fact that spiritualism and technology sort of depend on each other and need each other. And there are ways that has been misconstrued or misrepresented. So the last film was something quite important for us to include in the program, just to show a way that all of this can be parodied, and also a way that all of it can be misinterpreted or misrepresented. Anton, did you want to add something?
But the other thing about Shannon Moulton's work, that as much as it has amazing sense of humor, and it is a little bit of a parody, and it is totally, kind of a critical way of looking at the sort of commercial mysticism of everyday capitalist life. At the same time, it's very strange. Like, she has been working on the same project for more than 20 years now. And the degree of a kind of obsession or focus that requires for a filmmaker to basically keep making the same film for 20 years is incredible. So it's really like a very deeply felt project. And as you look at her more recent work, actually she developed a kind of a visual vocabulary where she produces representations that truly tap into some kind of a very, very powerful spiritual or mystical formations, that you could feel physically. Like the piece that we showed today was a very short one and maybe lighter one than some of the other works that she's made recently that we screened at Eflux last year. And I talked to her about that. I asked her, like, Shana, how, have you researched into history of occult representations and things like that? And she says, no, I just kind of do what comes to my mind. I go to garage sales and buy little, souvenirs and things like that. And so, but somehow she's completely plugged into a very, very, powerful and system of representations that are kind of very central to occult representations, And where it comes from, I'm not sure. Yeah.
And to add, I completely agree. It was amazing screening. To add, it's also, I think, there is a very interesting type of feminism or feminist artist filmmaking she represents, because she's always the kind of main character, alter ego, Cynthia. From the first film in 2010 or something till now, she plays that main character, and she also, on the one hand, as you mentioned, like really into playing it. It's like almost like she was talking about the separation between her persona and her alter ego, which like in 20 years it becomes really sometimes complicated. But at the same time, she also specifically looks at what the modes of spirituality present to American women, and you could notice in this film as well, and I think it's not maybe a very common way of she doesn't make like many statements, but I think she's very consistently having a kind of feminist perspective in her films, and also playing with that idea of agency, which is
thank you, by the way, that was super interesting. I was curious to know what you plan for the spirits who you will summon.
Well, I think we probably want to keep it a secret so that we can surprise you in August. Yeah. Yes. So it's a little bit too early for us to. Yes. Partly because we're still researching, and for example, for me, I really would like to understand the history of the religious history of Korea, the spiritual history. There is so much written about this. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of books. So, but of course, I will not be able to learn all about it. But I would like to give it some time before I start formulating kind of specific structures or ways of presenting art. So that's one reason. The other reason is that, as Hallie was saying, that we're very interested to work very specifically with scenography, and to try to, what was very important for us in Shanghai was to develop a kind of an exhibition that is unlike most of the large-scale exhibitions of contemporary art, which usually are very they're kind of like a very, it's a spectacle, and it's also something that's a little bit remote from you. The way you experience art in a museum, like you're not supposed to come close to it, you're not supposed to touch it, you're only supposed to kind of observe it. It's a cerebral experience. It's not necessarily supposed to be psychological or emotional so we wanted to try to create a situation where it's a completely different kind of experience, which is why we chose film as a model, because cinematic experience is completely psychological, completely emotional. As Lucas was saying, it is all about projecting yourself onto the film as much as the film, is projected on your retina. So we would like to try to find yet another language for this exhibition, which will be equally innovative. And of course, it takes time to, find the right way.
And the right technology.
안녕하세요. 오늘 프로그램 너무 잘 봤고요. 개인적으로도 굉장히 재밌어하는 주제여서 내년에 미디어시티 비엔날레가 정말 기대가 많이 됐는데요. 질문이라기보다는 약간 요청이나 코멘트로 들어주시면 좋을 것 같은데, 저는 좀 학생 때부터 미디어시티 비엔날레 계속 보고 있었고, 항상 되게 좋아하는 이제 이 서울시립미술관에서 진행하는 프로그램인데, 동시에 또 항상 조금 가지고 있는 문제가 친구들이나 비전공자들이랑 같이 보러 오기가 조금 그동안은 힘들었어요. 왜냐하면 좀 어렵다는 이제 커멘트들을 많이 들었었고, 근데 이번에 다루시는 주제가 지금 살고 있는 서울에 살고 있는 우리들이나 아니면 지금 트렌드상으로도 좀 많이 접점을 일으킬 수 있을 것 같거든요. 그래서 준비해 주실 때 조금 이제 그 대중들도 조금 감안을 해주시면서 이제 준비를 해주시면은 너무 좋을 것 같다라고 말씀드리고 싶었습니다. 오늘 프로그램 준비해 주셔서 너무 감사드립니다.
Thank you. I think we are definitely thinking on the same line, and we will definitely do it. And the idea what you were telling is related to that.
I mean, I'm of two minds about it. On the one hand, you know, maybe we discussed and we all want to try to make a show of, you know, contemporary art exhibition which is not hermetic, which is as accessible to somebody without any, you know, expertise or, you know, art historical knowledge. Just somebody interested to see art that could really feel and understand everything that is presented here. And I think the subject creates an opening for it, yeah? On the other hand, I see just, you know, doing some research, I see how, for example, shamanism is being really marketed these days, yeah? Everything becomes shamanistic, and it's used as an adjective to describe anything from fashion to food to music to film, you know, and you could see very clearly that there is a kind of a very commercial strategy to market something, yeah? So how to, on the one hand, use the sort of the positive, the productive part of this, while at the same time, how to critically sort of reject or distance yourself from the more sort of commercialization or banalization of these ideas.